Some stories don't begin with shouting or sirens. They begin with stillness, with the soft click of a car door, the wind brushing against the side of an old courthouse, and a woman straightening her collar before walking into history. Eleanor Pierce didn't plan to make a stand that morning. She only came to help a neighbor. But when a deputy's hand struck her across the face, it wasn't just her skin that was bruised, it was the silence that broke. In that single moment, decades of quiet injustice came rushing to the surface. This is not a tale of outrage, it's a story of restraint of dignity held like breath of one woman reminding a town that justice doesn't shout, it waits. Where are you watching from? And what time is it there? It was the kind of morning that passed without announcement, no sirens, no thunder, just the whisper of wind through dried cottonwood leaves and the slow roll of old tires over gravel. Eleanor Pierce adjusted the rear-view mirror of her sedan, glanced at the soft lines framing her face, and sighed quietly as the courthouse came into view, perched like a forgotten monument in the center of the dusty county square. She wasn't there for herself, not today. She was doing what she had always done long before retirement, long before grief became her closest companion, standing up for someone who didn't have the voice or the confidence to face a courtroom alone. The neighbor she was helping missed her. Dorsey was a widower in his 70s who hadn't missed a tax payment in his life until the property line dispute started, and now they were threatening to take his land over a sidewalk crack and unpaid code violations that came out of nowhere. Eleanor wasn't wearing a robe anymore. These days she wore quiet dignity like a shawl. A simple navy jacket, a pressed white blouse, and a pair of walking shoes built more for endurance than fashion. She didn't look like power, and she liked it that way. People underestimated you when you wore stillness instead of pride. The moment she turned into the lot behind the courthouse, she saw him a patrol car idling sideways, positioned not for safety but for control. The officer inside tapped the steering wheel as if waiting for something to break the monotony. Then, their eyes met. He pulled out slowly, not rushing, but with the precision of someone who believed his authority went unquestioned. His cruiser edged closer until finally he flicked his lights once, just enough to signal her to stop without drawing attention. She eased the car to the shoulder. The road was wide open with a field stretching endlessly on one side and the brick walls of the courthouse on the other. The sun was bright but cold, casting long shadows that gave everything a sharper edge. Eleanor rolled down her window, calm and measured. The officer stepped out. He was white, mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, in a way that looked good in uniform but carried a certain heaviness in his jaw, like he was always one sentence away from boiling over. His name tag read Brett. She'd never seen him before, and that already said something. Most of the deputies in this town had been here for years, but Brett wasn't from around here. You could tell from the way he walked, too aggressive, too calculated. "Ma'am, your rear taillight is out," he said flatly, eyes not on the light but on her hands, her face, her presence. "License and registration." "I'll get them from the glove compartment," she said, slowly reaching over. Her voice was steady, neutral, professional. She handed him the documents with practiced ease but didn't break eye contact. "I'm on my way to the courthouse for a hearing. I'm assisting a neighbor." "You talk a lot for someone who's already got one violation," he snapped, holding the papers without reading them, as if that alone gave him dominion. She blinked, not in surprise but in recognition. She had seen this kind of man before, the ones who wore the badge-like armor for their insecurities, the ones who mistook silence for submission. Eleanor didn't say anything more. She simply waited. The air grew dense as if the field itself had stopped rustling. He walked around the car, looked at the taillight, slapped it with the back of his hand as if proving something to himself, then came back to the window. "You got an attitude?" he asked, voice rising an inch. "No," she replied quietly, "but I do expect to be treated with respect." He leaned down too close, the smell of old coffee and sun-baked polyester clinging to him. "You think you're entitled to that just because you're some old lady in a nice blouse?" Something in his voice cracked then. A bitterness maybe, or boredom, or the heat of 1,000 unseen frustrations. But the moment stretched and broke, when without warning, he lifted his hand and struck her open palm swift and sharp across the face. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried. A dull, fleshy clap against skin and bone, echoing off the courthouse wall like the first gunshot of a storm. Her glasses slipped and hit the floorboard. Her head turned slightly, not from the force but from the insult. She didn't cry out. She didn't scream. She simply turned her eyes back toward him, steady as granite, and said, "Deputy, do you know who I am?" He smirked, and something in his smirk said everything. "I don't give a damn who you are. Around here you answer when I speak." She didn't respond. She just picked up her glasses, placed them back on her nose, checked that her hands weren't trembling, and stepped out of the vehicle. The wind moved around her like a second skin, cool and impartial. A security camera on the courthouse corner blinked lazily above her, and across the street, the door to a cafe swung open as a waitress stepped out with a tray, pausing mid-step when she saw what had just unfolded. Eleanor didn't look at the witnesses. She didn't shout for justice or plead her case. She adjusted her collar and walked toward the courthouse steps. Inside, a public defender by the name of Reuben Lang, who had argued cases in that courtroom for over 30 years, saw her come through the door with a slight mark across her left cheekbone. His breath caught, and he stood up without knowing why. Something about the way she walked, like the wind behind her, had changed direction. Like a fault line had shifted. A storm didn't always come with clouds. Sometimes it walked into a courthouse with quiet shoes and a bruise no one could ignore. Reuben Lang had just taken a sip of his lukewarm coffee when he saw her walk through the courthouse door, slow and deliberate, as if each step carried the weight of something more than the years. The moment struck him oddly, like seeing someone walk in wearing yesterday's storm. She wasn't limping, wasn't shaken, but there was a line of red across her cheek that hadn't been there before, a quiet mark of violence that didn't match her calm expression. He stood without thinking, the kind of involuntary motion that came from decades of courtroom instinct, like your body reacting before your brain could catch up. She didn't look at him directly, but he saw her eyes briefly pass over him, sharp-focused, not asking for help but silently daring the room to remain asleep. Across the foyer, Isabel Martinez paused mid-sentence with a clerk she had worked alongside for 17 years. The words caught in her throat, and her eyes narrowed toward Eleanor like someone trying to read an unfamiliar signal in familiar handwriting. The sunlight outside cast a white line across the tile floor, reaching toward Eleanor's feet like a quiet witness. No one spoke, not at first. It was as if a silent verdict had been delivered that only a few of them understood. Reuben set his cup down and walked toward her, gently intercepting her path without crowding it. "Judge Pierce," he asked, not loudly, but enough for her to hear. She turned slightly, her tone low and measured. "Hello, Reuben. I'm just here for Mr. Dorsey's hearing." He nodded, but his gaze moved briefly to her cheek, then back to her eyes. "Did something happen?" Her answer came not in words, but in the way she lifted her chin. "Something," she said. "Yes, but not something I'll let go unanswered." For a moment he considered asking more who, when, why, but something about the way she carried herself made the questions irrelevant. Eleanor wasn't here for sympathy or stories. She was here to shift something beneath the floorboards. He stepped aside as she continued on her shoes, tapping lightly against the tiled floor in a rhythm that filled the hallway with its own kind of gravity. Isabel approached Reuben slowly, her clipboard held like a shield, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's Judge Pierce," was Reuben replied. "She retired a few years back." "Then why does it feel like the whole damn building just changed temperature?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Around them, the buzz of printers and the murmurs of morning conversation resumed, but now everything felt fractionally quieter, like a collective breath being held. Reuben stood still, watching Eleanor disappear into the courtroom beyond the double doors, and for the first time in months, he felt like something true was about to happen in that place. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, rattling the panes faintly. The old oak trees along the sidewalk rustled in response, shedding dried leaves that spiraled down toward the cracked concrete below. In the parking lot, Deputy Brett stood beside his cruiser, arms crossed, chin slightly, raised, his expression unreadable but his stance overly rigid. He watched Eleanor's figure disappear into the courthouse with a twitch in his jaw. One part disbelief, another part arrogance, the rest likely fear dressed in denial. Inside the break room, the bailiff muttered something under his breath and glanced toward the security monitor that displayed the front entrance. Another clerk, younger and new to the building, caught the glimpse of Eleanor's name being mentioned and asked, Who is she?" Isabel leaned closer and replied with a tone that even she didn't realize was filled with awe. "She's the kind of woman who doesn't raise her voice because the walls already know to listen." Meanwhile, Eleanor stepped into the small side room where she usually waited before court, placing her leather tote on the table, removing a file neatly clipped for Mr. Dorsey's case. Her hands moved without hurry but not without purpose. She took out a tissue and dabbed the corner of her mouth gently, not to erase the pain but to acknowledge it. The slap hadn't stunned her physically. It had angered something deeper, a place in her that had long gone quiet, a place trained over years not to tremble at the sight of a badge or the sound of a threat. That part of her was awake again now, and it was not interested in silence. There was a mirror on the far wall, simple and unadorned, a leftover from when the room had been a witness interview space. She looked into it, examining the flush along her cheekbone, then straightened her collar. She did not frown. She did not wince. She simply said softly, almost to herself, 4 minutes. It was unclear what she meant by that, but the clock on the wall ticked on loud and steady, like footsteps in a hallway about to echo. 4 minutes later the door would open. 4 minutes later this building, this town, would learn exactly who it had just tried to put in her place. And in that space between now and then, Eleanor Pierce was preparing not for battle but for something far quieter, far more dangerous. The calm precision of justice returned to its rightful owner. The courtroom was already half full when Eleanor Pierce entered through the side door, the soft creak of the hinges barely audible over the hum of low voices and the shuffle of papers. A fluorescent light buzzed faintly overhead, and the smell of aged wood printer ink and old floor wax hung in the air like the scent of a place that had seen too much and learned to keep quiet. No one turned to look at her immediately, not because they didn't notice her, but because the presence she carried wasn't loud. It was weighty, like a storm building behind the clouds, not yet thundering but impossible to ignore. Her shoes clicked with even rhythm across the tiled floor, neither rushed nor tentative, each step a quiet statement that she belonged exactly where she was. At the bench, the presiding judge, Harold King, glanced up from his docket, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, and for a second his eyes widened with the startled recognition of a man seeing a ghost. He rose slightly, almost out of habit, but Eleanor held up a hand, gentle, steady, indicating there was no need. She didn't sit at the audience benches. Instead, she walked to the podium meant for attorneys and witnesses, placing her leather folder down with deliberate care. Her voice when she spoke was calm, measured, and laced with an authority that needed no introduction. "Your Honor," she began, "I'm here this morning not only as a citizen and legal advocate for Mr. Dorsey, but as a former federal judge requesting immediate review under federal jurisdiction." A ripple moved through the room, subtle but unmistakable. The kind of shift that happens when people don't yet understand the gravity of the moment, but their instincts tell them something just cracked beneath the surface. The judge cleared his throat, leaned forward slightly, and removed his glasses, folding them slowly between his fingers. "Judge Pierce," he said, his voice strained but polite, "is there something we should be aware of before we proceed with this hearing?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her folder and pulled out a single page, a formal statement of incident folded once and already signed. She handed it to the court clerk, who passed it forward with trembling fingers. Eleanor turned back toward the judge, her voice steady. "This morning I was assaulted by Deputy Marshal Kyle Brett during what he claimed was a routine traffic stop," she said. "I was on my way here in service to this court when the assault occurred. I have submitted a written affidavit and have requested contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Given the nature of the event and the potential pattern of misconduct associated with Deputy Brett's conduct, I am invoking the emergency federal oversight protocol established under Title 42. The silence that followed her words was different from the usual hush that courts maintain. It was deeper, colder, and more conscious. Judge King sat back in his chair, the paper now in his hand, and you could almost see the color drain from his face as he read the top line. Around the room, glances passed between clerks, deputies, and even 2 junior lawyers, who had only come in for a continuance motion. Something bigger than a simple hearing was happening here, and it was unfolding with the terrifying grace of a slow-moving avalanche. At the back of the room, Isabel Martinez stood frozen beside the door, her hand still gripping the edge of a clipboard she no longer remembered holding. Her breath caught as the reality of Eleanor's words settled into her bones, and for the first time in years, she felt both terrified and relieved. Terrified because of what it meant, and relieved because someone had finally said it out loud. "Do you have any injuries that require immediate medical attention?" the judge asked quietly, his voice now more human, less official. "I do not," Eleanor replied. "But I believe the health of this court is very much in need of examination." There was a rustle of movement as the bailiff approached Judge King, whispering something too soft to hear. The judge nodded, then turned back to Eleanor. "Your request for federal oversight will be formally acknowledged on record. We will recess for 10 minutes while I make the appropriate call to the U.S. Attorney's Office." Eleanor gave a single nod, nothing theatrical, just a quiet confirmation that the wheels were finally turning. She stepped away from the podium and moved to the gallery seats, sitting not as a victim or guest, but as someone reclaiming her rightful place in a space she had once governed with clarity and care. Her presence didn't demand obedience, it invited accountability. Outside, the wind picked up again, tapping gently against the high windows of the courtroom, as if the building itself were listening. On the courthouse steps, a local school teacher named Carla Jensen, who had been grading papers in her car before walking in, uploaded a short video to social media, blurry but unmistakable. A uniformed officer striking an elderly woman who never raised her voice. Within minutes, the post had over 1,000 views. Within the hour, it would be in the inbox of a federal investigator. But inside that courtroom, time moved differently. It moved with the weight of memory and consequence and long-awaited reckoning. Eleanor sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed not on anyone in particular, but on the space where the law should have always lived between fear and power, between silence and truth. And for the first time in years, that space felt like it might finally be waking up. The news broke before lunch, traveling faster than anyone expected, cutting through the dry autumn air like a siren you couldn't hear, but still felt in your bones. By noon, a local reporter had picked up the story from social media and called it what it was: retired federal judge struck by local deputy in courthouse parking lot. No fluff, no speculation, just the stark truth staring back in black and white from phone screens across the county. The image they used was grainy, taken from across the street through a windshield, but unmistakable. Deputy Brett's hand mid-motion, Eleanor's face turned, and the courthouse looming silently behind them like an unwitting accomplice. Within the hour, the video was picked up by 3 regional outlets, then a national one. The algorithms didn't hesitate. They rarely did when an older woman in a simple blouse gets hit by a man in uniform. Back at the courthouse, Ruben Lang watched the world shift in real time. The quiet corridors suddenly crowded with murmurs and side-eyes, as if everyone had just realized they'd been living inside a powder keg, with no idea when the spark would land. Isabel walked past him quickly, her face pale, clipboard forgotten somewhere behind her, her steps clipped and purposeful, like she didn't trust herself to stop moving. In the clerk's office, someone whispered, "Did you see it? The video?" That was her. Another voice, unsure but curious, asked. She used to be a federal judge, to which Ruben finally said, not loudly but firmly, "She still is. You don't stop being what you are just because you hang up the robe." Outside the sheriff's department, things weren't so quiet. Deputy Brett stood with arms folded, lips tight, denying everything into a dozen microphones now crowding the precinct sidewalk. She was combative, he claimed. "I was forced to act in defense of procedure." His voice didn't tremble, but his eyes twitched just slightly when one reporter raised a phone mid-question. "Deputy, have you seen the footage?" He didn't answer. Instead, Sheriff Galton stepped in with a forced smile and a hand on Brett's shoulder, issuing statements about internal review, due process, and the unfortunate timing of certain narratives. But the damage was already done, and the courthouse wasn't the only place where silence had begun to rot. Eleanor remained in the building not because she had to, but because she chose to. Her presence had become something more than symbolic. It was stabilizing, like a lighthouse sitting still while the tide pulled everything else apart. She spent the afternoon meeting quietly with the federal liaison, reviewing her affidavit in a borrowed office, while the blinds stayed closed and the hall outside buzzed with uncertainty. At one point, she looked out through the crack in the blinds and watched as 3 officers from the Department of Justice stepped out of a black SUV and walked up the steps without knocking. That moment, quiet, official, and heavy with consequence, marked the beginning of what no one could stop anymore. That evening, a second video surfaced. This one came from a teenager parked 2 rows down in the lot, waiting on her mother to finish jury duty. It was clearer, closer, and more damning than the first. Brett's tone was audible, condescending, and laced with aggression. Eleanor's voice, in contrast, was calm, restrained, impossible to mistake for threatening. The sound of the slap rang out in that clip like a bell tolling the end of an era. And when people heard it, something inside them cracked, especially the ones who'd experienced something similar, but never had proof, never had witnesses, never had someone with enough authority to break the cycle. By the time the courthouse closed for the day, 3 formal complaints had been filed by citizens who had been stopped or fined by Brett in the last year. By Friday, there would be 17. Stories began to emerge, like water rising through floorboards: unpaid traffic violations that morphed into bench warrants, towed vehicles never entered into the system, arrests without paperwork, court fees multiplied, without explanation. And it wasn't just Brett. His name was the most visible, the most recent, but his methods were learned, passed down, approved in silence by a system too used to looking the other way. Sheriff Galton had signed off on dozens of questionable citations. A deputy named Holland had rerouted traffic fine collections through a private processing agency he quietly co-owned with a cousin out of state. The rot was wide, but Eleanor had struck at the part closest to the nerve. That night, Eleanor sat in her kitchen alone but not lonely, her tea cooling beside her, as she read through a stack of printed messages people had sent since the story broke. Some were from strangers thanking her, others from former colleagues offering quiet support. One note, written in careful cursive from a woman in a nearby county, simply said, "My grandson cried when he saw someone finally stood up. He's 12. Thank you." Eleanor held that letter a moment longer than the rest. When the federal team reconvened the next morning, she was already there, early composed files, organized, eyes clear. She wasn't interested in revenge, and she wasn't fueled by rage. What she carried instead was precision, discipline, and a kind of moral gravity that couldn't be undone by denial or deflection. She gave them everything: records, context, historical notes on the county's policing practices, stories whispered to her by citizens who had no one else to trust. "This isn't about me," she told them plainly. "This is about what's been growing in the dark for too long." And so the investigation expanded. What began with a single slap outside a courthouse bloomed into something vast and overdue. Eleanor's actions weren't a rebellion, they were a reckoning. And in towns like theirs, where power had long gone unchecked, that reckoning felt both miraculous and terrifying, like hearing a familiar song and realizing for the first time what the lyrics really meant. It was still dark when Eleanor Pierce arrived at the courthouse, long before the reporters, the attorneys, or even the janitors began their quiet sweep through the marble halls. The parking lot shimmered faintly with dew, and the building itself stood under the early gray of morning, like a monument carved out of silence, waiting to be awakened by the sound of consequence. She sat in her car for a moment longer than usual, her hands resting quietly on the steering wheel, not trembling, just still like the calm surface of deep water, holding back what only she knew was coming. The court would open its doors in 30 minutes, but the judgment already stirred in the air like the first rustle of wind before a storm you can feel in your chest. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting their usual pale glow over the benches and worn oak panels. But today, everything seemed sharper, more precise, as if the very light in the room knew not to blur the truth. A federal judge had been brought in to preside over the hearing, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair, and the kind of posture that doesn't bend for politics or pressure. Eleanor had met her once years ago during a judicial review conference. That day they'd spoken not about law, but about fatigue, about what it means to hold power without letting it change the shape of your soul. The courtroom slowly filled, not with onlookers or tourists, but with townspeople, former clients, teachers, small business owners, people who had lived under the quiet weight of a system they never had the tools to question. The pews were crowded with stories unspoken, injustices, unfiled complaints, unpaid tickets that cost people their jobs, and warnings passed, like folklore, about which roads not to take and which uniforms not to provoke. The walls held their breath as if they too were waiting to see whether justice would arrive with its usual disguise or finally reveal its true face. When Kyle Brett entered escorted by 2 U.S. Marshals, he looked less like the man from the video and more like someone trying to remember what authority felt like when it had belonged to him. He kept his jaw tight, his eyes narrow, but his hands, those told a different story entirely. They twitched when he sat down, when he glanced around, when he realized that no one in the room, not even the court clerk, would meet his gaze. Beside him, his attorney whispered, "Say nothing unless asked directly." He nodded once, but his shoulders didn't relax. Eleanor sat near the front, not on the stand, not behind the bench, but in the gallery, close enough to be seen, far enough to speak only when called. She wore the same jacket from that morning unpressed, but clean, the faintest thread still loose, at one sleeve, a silent reminder that strength didn't require polish. She didn't look at Brett. Instead, she kept her eyes on the federal judge, on the space between the gavel and the truth, waiting for the moment when silence would be broken not by noise but by responsibility. When the time came, the judge spoke firmly, her voice filling the courtroom like water poured into a dry well. The court recognizes the testimony of the witness, the evidence submitted by the Department of Justice, and the series of statements compiled over the last 6 weeks. No one moved. No one dared breathe too loudly. Eleanor was called forward. She stood slowly, deliberately, and took the oath with a voice so calm it stilled even the coughs and shifting feet in the room. "Do you swear to tell the truth?" the clerk asked. "I have always," Eleanor replied gently, and a few heads in the room dropped slightly, not in shame but in reverence. She didn't deliver a dramatic speech. She didn't cry or demand apology. Instead, she told the truth the way only someone who had lived inside the law could tell it, methodically, precisely, and with no space for interpretation. She spoke of process of abuse, disguised as protocol of a culture that rewarded aggression and punished restraint. She described the moment Brett struck her, not as a singular act, but as the final symptom of a sickness that had been allowed to grow unchecked. "This wasn't about me," she said softly. "It never was. It was about what happens when fear becomes currency and justice becomes optional." The judge said nothing for several long seconds after Eleanor stepped down, and in that silence, something inside the courtroom shifted, not loudly but permanently. When the sentencing was finally read, Brett didn't react. 22 years, 2 federal counts of assault under color of law, multiple civil rights violations, 1 count of obstruction of justice. The gavel struck once, no applause, no protest, just the clean, sharp echo of accountability delivered. He was escorted out without handcuffs, but no one mistook that for dignity. It was simply procedure. As he passed by the gallery, his eyes flicked briefly toward Eleanor. She didn't return the glance. She simply looked straight ahead into the space where the law had always belonged. Outside, the sun had risen fully, now casting a quiet gold across the courthouse steps, as people emerged slowly, like waking from a long, uncertain night. Some nodded to Eleanor as they passed, some smiled faintly, and others simply walked beside her in silence. Isabel met her at the bottom of the stairs, tears welling, but not falling. "You didn't just change the court," she said quietly. "You changed the town." Eleanor placed a hand gently on her arm and answered with a voice as even as ever. "No, Isabel. The town was ready. It just needed to see someone stop bowing." And then she walked away, not toward the cameras or the press, but toward her car, the same one with the cracked taillight which she still hadn't fixed. Some things she thought are worth leaving broken for a little while, if only to remember how easily they were overlooked in the first place. It was a quiet Saturday morning when Eleanor Pierce unfolded the folding chairs beneath the old elm tree in the neighborhood park, her movements slow but sure, each one deliberate, as if teaching the earth that order could still exist without permission. The breeze carried the distant scent of cut grass and late summer leaves, and somewhere nearby a sprinkler clicked, methodically spitting water across a yellowing lawn. Children played farther off, near the swings, their voices rising and falling like birdsong, untouched by the heaviness that had hung over this place for so long. Eleanor smoothed the back of her blouse, took a deep breath, and laid her worn leather notebook on the picnic table beside a stack of handouts labeled "Know Your Rights, a Community Conversation." By 9:30 the benches had begun to fill with quiet figures, older folks who remembered when protest meant something dangerous, single mothers balancing toddlers on their hips, and teenagers who had only seen justice on screens until now. Isabel Martinez was there too, handing out bottled water, her sleeves rolled up and her clipboard nowhere in sight for once. She caught Eleanor's eye and gave a simple nod, not of obligation but of partnership, the kind built in silence after long months of watching something impossible finally take root. Eleanor cleared her throat softly and began to speak, not with a microphone or podium, but with the kind of voice people naturally leaned in to hear, a voice tempered by time, by grief, and by the knowledge that not everything worth saying needs to be loud. The law, she said, was never meant to belong to the few who enforce it, but to the many who live beneath it. Heads turned gently toward her, not because of the words, but because of the weight behind them, the way they settled like pebbles dropped into water, sending out quiet ripples of thought. She didn't lecture. She told stories about the man who paid 5 times his ticket fine because he didn't know he could contest it, about the woman whose car was towed for an expired tag and lost her job walking to work in the rain. Somewhere during the second hour, a young man named Corey raised his hand, his voice unsure but brave. "What if you speak up and nobody believes you?" he asked. Eleanor looked at him a moment longer than most, would not with pity but with recognition. "You speak anyway," she said, "because sometimes the first one to speak isn't believed, but the second one remembers, and the third one listens. That's how it changes." The group was silent after that, not from fear, but from realization. A few wrote that sentence down. By noon the shadows had shifted under the trees, and the chairs began to creak as people rose, lingered, and slowly walked back into their lives. Eleanor stayed a while longer, collecting papers, folding chairs, wiping the picnic table clean with a small cloth she always carried in her purse. She didn't do it for show, she just believed in leaving things better than she found them. As she moved, a girl no older than 10 approached her with a sheet of paper and asked softly, "Are you the lady from the video?" Eleanor smiled gently, crouched to eye level, and answered, "I am. But more important, I'm someone who listens. What's on your mind?" The girl handed her the paper. It was a drawing of a tree, and beneath it a small figure with a wide smile and silver hair. "That's you," the girl said. "You make people feel safe." Eleanor didn't reply right away. She just nodded slowly, the edges of her eyes warm with something like hope. That evening the town courthouse stood still, its doors closed and its windows glowing faintly under the dimming sky. But now beside its steps, newly installed, and catching the light just so, was a modest bronze plaque. It read, "In honor of Judge Eleanor Pierce, who reminded us that dignity is not granted but claimed." It wasn't large, it wasn't flashy, but it was real. And for the first time in a long while, those who passed it felt the urge to stop and read it, not out of obligation but out of quiet respect for what it meant. Eleanor visited it just once in the early morning before most had woken. She stood for several minutes, hands in her coat pockets, eyes on the inscription, not out of vanity but reflection. Her breath steamed faintly in the air, and behind her the town stirred awake. Garbage trucks grinding into motion, dogs barking in the distance, coffee pots burbling inside kitchens whose curtains hadn't yet been drawn. She whispered something to the wind, too soft for anyone to hear, then turned and walked away down the sidewalk, not in a hurry, not with purpose, but with presence still here, still standing, still herself. The world had not changed overnight. There were still policies to fight, still systems that bent in the wrong direction when no one was watching. But in that one place, on that one street, something fundamental had shifted, an understanding, a collective memory, a line that would not be uncrossed again. And at the heart of that shift stood a woman who didn't seek recognition, didn't demand reverence, and never raised her voice unless the silence had gone on too long. She didn't wear robes anymore, but in the way she moved, the way she listened, the way she stood when others bowed, there was no mistaking what justice looked like when it finally arrived. What happened in that quiet town wasn't just about one officer, one courthouse, or one woman. It was about a system that had been broken for too long, and the quiet power of someone who chose not to stay silent. Eleanor Pierce didn't fight back with anger or vengeance. She answered injustice with truth, discipline, and a steady refusal to be erased. Her story reminds us that dignity is not something you're given, it's something you protect, even when the world tells you to shrink. For those who have ever felt powerless in the face of authority, who have been told to move along, stay quiet, or accept what isn't right, this story is for you. It's a reminder that justice doesn't always arrive in grand speeches or loud protests. Sometimes it shows up in the calm voice of someone who knows the law better than those who abuse it. And in communities where silence has been used as a tool of control, one person standing firm can create a ripple strong enough to bring down walls. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know or someone you used to be, don't let it end here. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that shine a light where others fear to look. Because the fight for justice isn't over, and sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that speaks last and speaks softly.